go through here, first off, there's one basic ground rule. Whoops, your head's getting in front of the camera there, I don't know.
Don't want that.
Yeah. So the ground rule is pretty straightforward. If you have a question, ask it. Ask it as it comes up. Don't be patient and wait till the end, because that's a good way to forget what you were going to say.
Okay.
So, but that's really the only ground rule. Now, next thing I'll do is just talk about my language. So, as I go through here, I'll be using 4 main terms: average, above average, below average, or impaired. Average means doing about as I'd expect for somebody your age, your background, and no injury or any health conditions. So this is the person that I'd compare you to, if you hadn't had a motorcycle accident that day.
Okay.
Above average means doing better than I'd expect, something that's a strength or a skill or a talent for you, as compared to people with your background and no injury. Below average means, basically means good enough to get by. So it's not a skill, it's not a talent, it's a bit of a weakness. But it's a weakness that you can work around in day-to-day life without too much difficulty. So if your memory is below average, then you may find that you're more likely to make notes, just to help keep up with the details. But the notes are there to jog your memory rather than relying on the notes completely. If I say impaired, that's where I'm saying this is something that's becomes a problem in day-to-day life, and something where you do have to do things differently. And in some cases, you may have to say, this is a problem for me, and I need someone else to help me with this. So, if your memory is impaired, then instead of using notes to jog your memory, then you're using notes to really reconstruct your memory. I'll look back at my notes because I don't trust my memory. Or you might use electronic aids. Video camera is a perfect example of that. And that's going to record things much better than anybody's memory ever will. Okay? Making sense?
Yes, beautifully.
All right.
And I really like your delivery on camera. Just want to make sure by getting your face in there.
Okay.
So I'm not in the way or anything there.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable position though, is it?
No, but it's good to have your eye contact.
So when we first did this assessment, just looking back on our dates here, so that was, oh goodness, my assistant put the tag over it. But that was back in 2000. And then what was showing up was that you showed up with problems with memory for what you heard or what you saw, some problems with your concentration on and off, and the biggest problems were with planning and organizing. So thinking ahead, trying to keep track of 3 or 4 things at once and juggling them. Those are the things that we looked at that showed up as problems. One of the things that didn't show up as a concern was your mood. You actually reported less distress or stress than most people we see after an injury. And that can mean one of a few things. Either life's going pretty well, you don't have to deal with too many stresses. Sometimes it means that there's a lot of stresses in your life, but you're not paying attention to them.
It was denial. As I look back, it was proving I was normal.
Well, that's certainly something that can happen.
Yeah.
So, today, looking at this assessment from a week ago, what we can do is to compare to what happened in 2000, what's changed over the past 6 to 7 years, and how that fits in with what we'd expect of normal recovery. One of the other things that's an important part of this puzzle is that you had I think it was an MRI
Yeah.
a few years ago. And And what that showed was some signs of bruising or injury over the front parts of your brain. And those are the parts that have a lot to do with planning, organizing, thinking ahead, catching difficulties, and also they're pretty involved in your dealings with other people, focusing on other people's moods, in a conversation, knowing when to talk and when to listen, when to really put all your effort into figuring out what someone else is thinking, and when to put your effort into putting out your own agenda. Okay?
Yeah.
So, first thing that I usually talk about is, during the testing session that you had last week, your behavior. How did you approach this? Okay. Because that's pretty important. What's your style like when you're dealing with problems? And two things showed up there. One is that you worked really hard. You got absorbed in this. You were trying to figure out what's a strategy that's going to help me do this best, whether it's following along with my fingers so I don't lose eye contact, whether it's trying to stay organized. You enjoyed the challenge and you worked hard. So that's really important right there, right? Because that's one of the most important styles to bring to anything after an injury. Second thing that showed up had to do with a little bit of your interpersonal style, how you deal with other people. And what showed up there, and this is probably not a surprise to you, that you're a little bit talkative, and there were times when you benefited from some subtle cues to slow you down or step back and to say, all right, I've said my piece now, I need to pause, listen, and move on. And that fits in with some of the bruising towards the front parts of the brain, and that balancing your attention to yourself and what you want to say and your attention to other people, I think that's more of an effort now. It's not automatic. It's something you actually have to think about.
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
Yeah, I've developed a style where I ask the other person, so I know I'm not talking about myself all the time.
Yeah.
So you have a tendency, I had a tendency to do that, to just talk about myself. So.
And that's a pretty common experience. And a lot of people find that they do have to, really consciously ask that question. And then that gets to be a very useful cue.
Yeah, it's been helpful.
So one of the things that, looking at test scores, which are probably the least important part of all this, but they're a good jumping off point. So looking at your scores on the various tests that we did, first area that we usually look at is your reasoning, which is your knowledge and your problem solving. And what shows up there? Your reasoning when it comes to pictures and designs is above average. Again, this is compared to people who've never had an injury. So this is a clear strength for you, and I'm sure it was a clear strength for you before this injury. But it's still a strength.
Nice
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your reasoning when it comes to words. Your reasoning when it comes to words shows up as being at the high end of average. And again, that's pretty consistent with how it was in 2000. It doesn't look like it's changed. So I'm going to say average here, but it's at the high end of average. When it comes to your ability to come up with words, we looked at your skills to generate words. Tell me as many words as you can that go in this category, for example. And what showed up there, those skills show up now as being about average. Now, when you did this sort of test 7 years ago, those skills were below average. So they've really improved fairly substantially. They've not gotten worse, they've improved.
Well, that's fair. Not only can remember the tests when you told me about the test before, I couldn't remember.
Okay.
So I'm able to sort of relate.
Yeah.
Uh,
So some of the things that we're saying, your reasoning skills don't look like they've gotten worse. They may actually have improved a little bit from 7 years ago. Good news.
yeah.
And there's certainly not showing up as any problems. In fact, perhaps strengths. So, next area we usually look at is your attention, your thinking speed, your ability to switch your attention from one thing to another, or your ability to concentrate on two things at once. Now, those are all different aspects of attention. Some of these are easier than others. First thing that we look at is your attention for what you hear, and especially your ability to multitask, to maintain focus on two things at once. And what shows up there on our testing is that these skills are above average. Okay. That is a strength for you. I'm also guessing that that's a strength because you work at it. If you just do it automatically in the background without putting much thought to it, I wouldn't be surprised if those skills get to be average or even a little below average.
I feel like
Things
I'm
that-
almost cheating because I really stop and think,
Yeah.
and where I'd normally
Yeah.
I just rattle it off, but now I really think.
But when you put your mind to it,
I know why I'm doing two things at once.
yes. So I think it's important there to know that you can do this, but also to know that to do it properly, you don't take it for granted. You work at it.
Yeah.
And in general life, it gets important to cut down the distractions when you don't need them. Otherwise, you put a lot of effort into ignoring things, which just makes life that little bit harder. Okay. Your attention for what you see. We look at that a couple of different ways. One is through your visual scanning. The skills that you use in driving, for example. Is there something there? Is there something there? So just scanning your environment. Or the skills when you're reading through a page of text, you're looking for a key word or a name. Anytime when you're dealing with a lot of distractions and you're trying to pick out one piece of information. Nowadays, those skills show up as being average. And that's pretty consistent with how they were 7 years ago. As I say, these are the sorts of skills that are important in driving. They're the sorts of skills important anytime you're trying to search out one piece of information. Other area that we look at is speed, your thinking speed. And we know after an injury, at first, when there's a little disruption throughout the brain, as happens after a car accident, a motorcycle accident, any sort of high-speed accident, that thinking speed can be one of the things that's most affected. For you, right now, what showed up is that on our testing, your thinking speed shows up as being impaired. Okay. So when you're doing something that doesn't call for a lot of thinking, but it just calls for doing something pretty simple, but doing it over and over and over pretty fast, that does take longer for you.
Hmm.
Okay. Does that make sense?
So what? Explain just a little further.
So, an example of thinking speed might be just going through and, if you're proofreading something, how long does it take you to read? Not that you're trying to make sense out of it, but you're just scanning it through with your eyes. Okay. Or, anytime you're looking for details, something that's out of place. But you don't have to make sense of it. You're just looking for details. So scanning is to catch it if it's there, You know, and speed is how quickly you can do that scanning.
Okay. How does that compare to years ago?
Compared to years ago, it's actually a little worse. You know, why that is, I'm not sure. One of the reasons maybe is that we often do this test a little later in the morning, and so, or a little later in the afternoon, and so it's possible that you know, you're getting fatigued, and so we do know that as people get fatigued, their speed slows down. If this was showing up with a lot of other things, I'd be a little cautious and I'd be wondering what's going on. But if it shows up by itself, then that's more of a, that's interesting, but don't panic over it. Next area that we looked at is your memory. And your memory showed up as definitely being different from 7 years ago. 7 years ago, you showed up with definitely having some weaknesses in your memory. Your memory for what you see, your memory for what you hear. Nowadays, your memory for what you hear shows up as being, I'd call it low average. Again, that means good enough for day-to-day life, but not really a strength, and definitely helped by writing things down or using some sort of aid. And compared to 7 years ago, it's definitely improved. Comparing, not just the scores, but your overall performance has definitely taken several steps up.
In my memory?
In your memory.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's improved. Okay.
It has. And I'm just looking here. One of the things that really showed up is that you were using some strategies. For example, trying to remember things in the order in which you hear them. That's probably not the best strategy, but it is a strategy. And anytime you're using a strategy, it's likely to help you because it makes you think more about it. The other thing that showed up is that when you have reminders, that really boosts your memory.
I also, like with all the equipment and computer stuff that I do and everything, I have a way of, I have places for everything.
Yeah.
Certain camera goes here, the iPod goes here, the keys here, they're zipped in, and
Yes.
you're just doing things to eliminate the hassle.
Absolutely. And that's a strategy.
Yeah.
So it makes things automatic. You don't have to think through it each time.
Yeah.
Your memory for what you see looks to be, again, I'd call it low average. And that's several steps up from where it was 7 years ago. One of the things that also shows up, when you're doing this, you have a much better sense, I need to remember this for later. And when you approach anything that way, that helps your memory.
Well, years ago it was in denial. Now when I came into these areas of testing, I was really tense about it. I was probably could have done better if I just hit it.
But
with
you,
a
you,
normal
had
attitude.
you had something to prove.
Yeah.
Now, so these have definitely improved quite a bit from 7 years ago. And that's also important for another reason, because we do know some people, as they get older after an injury, aging can happen faster. An injury can age your brain, and so your brain ages more quickly after an injury. If that was happening for you, I'd expect to see these scores going down, not going up.
Well, I'm fighting that. I realize that age is a part of it.
So it looks like what you're doing to fight that, to bear that in mind, is being pretty effective.
Yeah.
Good.